Accordé. Welcome, Frederick.
Great to be here.
Just a Gardner.
Yeah.
Warm welcome.
So much. Good to be here. All right. Okay. Sounds good.
There's a new European Commission that recently started under Ursula von der Leyen, who wants to explicitly be a geopolitical commission, vowing to play a prominent role on the world stage. Is that realistic at all, according to you?
Sure. You know, I was here for 3 years as ambassador to the EU, and I believed, even before I arrived, particularly after I left, that the EU is a superpower. Not a traditional superpower, but it has a lot of sources of influence, particularly in trade, but not only. As a regulatory power and in other ways, but those are the two principal ones. So I think the Commission's absolutely right to say, how can we in the EU identify well the sources of our influence and protect and project our values around the world? And that's because of the international context, obviously, which has been challenging in the past, but now arguably more challenging than ever before. Mm-hmm. Not only because of Russia and Northern Africa and all the crises in the immediate vicinity, but also because of the United States, which is no longer the partner that many people in Europe were hoping for. So the short answer is yes, I think the Commission is right. And I think there are real tools to make sure that the EU does stand up for its interests better.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Is that mostly through soft power? Because, as you mentioned, the world is a difficult place, and the EU's neighbors are pretty troublesome in the regions that you mentioned, Northern Africa and the Middle East.
Well, we often underestimate soft power. You might remember that Stalin once said, how many divisions does the Vatican have, does the Pope have? Mm-hmm. Of course, that was a silly question. And if you ask, well, how many divisions does the EU have? It's the wrong question. The EU has huge sources of influence that are not military and not even necessarily related to security. I mentioned two of them. I mean, trade and regulatory are hugely important because the EU is setting today more and more the agenda for the entire world on things like data privacy, but also on the digital economy, things like on copyright, and also online platforms and their responsibilities in this new economy, and also on tax, by the way. Lots of areas where the EU actually does project its influence. But I do think that the EU can be more disciplined in making sure that it stands up for itself. And one area, just to give you an example, is the single market. It's hugely important in the sense that many countries want access to the single market. The EU can say, for example, if you want to come and play in the single market, China, for example, you have to play by our rules. There are rules like state aid rules in the EU, and in China there are none. You cannot, Chinese companies benefit from state subsidies in China and come and buy up our companies here.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With regard to trade, it's one area of tension between the US and the EU. Now that the situation between the US and China seems to have eased a little bit, would you expect more friction between the US and the EU?
Well, unfortunately, there has been a fair amount of friction already, and
Mm-hmm.
I don't think it's going to go away. For example, the unilateral tariffs that have been slapped on the EU is one example. And there are other things that may well occur soon that will add to the friction. One of them is this digital sales tax, even though apparently there's a truce between France and the US, but I'm not sure it will last a long time. But there are other things that will add to this friction. For example, if the EU does, in a few years, impose a carbon border adjustment mechanism, essentially a tax, on imported goods from countries that don't respect the Paris Agreement, you can imagine that's going to create an enormous amount of friction with the United States.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. With regard to trade, but also relations with the EU in general, but also with the situation in Iran, the Middle East, is what we're seeing from the US right now, is that the execution of President Trump's main election promise, namely to put America first?
Well, I think that phrase is nonsense, to be blunt. We didn't need to make America great again. It was great. Every president essentially put America first. But to think that working with allies or working in a multilateral context puts America second is crazy. You know, every president, including Republicans, many Republicans, understood that in order to protect our interests effectively in the world, we often have to work with others, including the EU, including the UN, and so on, and including within the WTO, the World Trade Organization. So I think the whole premise is totally flawed, and we're seeing the outcome of all the consequences of all this right now, because this president is not promoting U.S. interests over the long term. That's the basic point. He's undermining the sources of U.S. influence.
It's not hard to guess that you're a Democrat from that last comment, but you're also involved with the election campaign of former Vice President Joe Biden. That whole marathon of the presidential election kicks off in less than 2 weeks in Iowa. Are you optimistic that your candidate can become the nominee first and then win the general election?
I'm always optimistic. Americans are optimistic. It's part of the culture we were brought into, right? I mean, pessimism is self-defeating. But honestly, I think we have a chance to win this election. I really do. You know, people often think of history in linear terms. Trump is president, he'll get reelected. Hillary was going to be an obvious shoo-in. She wasn't. You know, history's not linear. He can be defeated. You even look at the polls. The polls indicate that he can be defeated. I think Joe Biden has the best chance of defeating this president for many reasons. But the biggest reason is he has an ability to communicate with this constituency, this demographic of blue-collar workers in those key swing states in the Rust Belt, who have been, I think, correctly felt forgotten by many others. His whole record has been in public service and has an ability to connect in a way that few other candidates have, and he has the experience that's far beyond any other candidate. So I think he has a reasonable chance of being the Democratic candidate, and if he is, I think he has a good chance of winning the election.
Well, we'll all keep close attention. Thank you very much for this, and enjoy your time in Brussels.
Thanks a lot.